Well, hello again, everyone. This is Gary Sheffer from the Hudson Area Library History Room. I've got a terrific guest here today, Ted Hilscher, somebody I've known for a long time. And many of you in the area know Ted. He's a local attorney, and he's also an associate professor of history at Columbia Green Community College. And we're going to talk about a project that he's been working on the history of Hudson, or related to the history of Hudson and urban renewal. Ted, thank you for doing this.
Gary, I'm very happy to be here.
You know, so what we call this is the Hudson Area Library History Room on Zoom. So it's like,
Very
did
good.
you ever think that you would, you've made it, Ted, is what I'm telling you.
It's outstanding. It's outstanding. I'm familiar. I've used the Hudson Area Library History Room and many times, and this is a terrific opportunity. I'm glad to be with you. I see you've got a little bit of gray hair there.
Yeah, well, I'll take any color hair, Ted, at this point.
Gary and I have known each other for well, let's see, 40 something years.
I would say so, Ted. But
Yeah.
Look, you're doing pretty well yourself. You got a rug, but it's as gray as snow. So listen, so tell me, you grew up in Hudson, in Claverick, really, right?
Grew up in the hinterlands out in Claverick, yes.
Yeah, and you went to Hudson High School. Then you went to college and got a law degree, right?
I did. I went to Fordham, and I graduated from Fordham, and somebody told me, "Go west, young man." So I went to Catskill, and I'm practicing law. My wife and I have a law practice in Catskill, and I'm also I teach a little bit at the college at Columbia Green Community College. It's very near and dear to me. It's a wonderful place, and they let me teach history there. And once in a while, I teach constitutional law, and I
great
political science. So we.
What do you teach, Ted, on the history course? What do you focus on?
Well, it's a survey course. I teach U.S. history, up to the Civil War and then after the Civil War. So it's a survey course.
I gotcha. Well, interesting topics, and good for you. And Columbia Green is a great place. It really is. It's such an asset to. But I can't believe you're on the wrong side of the bridge. But we'll talk about that another time. That's clearly, this is the good side where you can see the mountains, not actually live in them. But so that brings us to the project you're working on, and I'm going to let you talk about it. But folks in Hudson will, of course, remember Art Cowick and the business that he ran, which was on Warren Street, Town Fair, toys, and I think they sold baby furniture too. And it was my favorite place to go when I was a kid. It was Toyland. And but Art was also head of the City Planning Commission. And back in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, in the urban renewal era of city planning, Art was very involved in all the things going on in Hudson. And now there's a photo collection that you're helping to curate. Ted, why don't you tell us what you're doing, how the photos came to Columbia Green, and then we can talk about some of the content that you're looking for.
I would love to, Gary. Mr. Cowick, as you say, was the chairman, and I'm sorry if it's not his exact title, but he was the chairman of the Planning Commission in the city of Hudson at the time of urban renewal. And urban renewal, I don't have my notes with me. I don't want to. I don't want to lecture here today, but urban renewal, as I recall, I've begun to study it a little bit in the city of Hudson. I've been going through in my free time, which I don't have much of, but I've tried to make some time and gone through some Hudson Register Star archives, and I'm trying to piece together some details about that. And that took place back in 1971, 1972. and it really transformed. It transformed, as you know, and any of us who have been here in Columbia County for since that time. It transformed the western end of the city of
Exactly.
Hudson. And Mr. Kowick, in his capacity, collected slides. He had a collection of slides, and basically they sat in his house for all these years since the early 1970s. And I had a conversation with Mr. Kowick, pick his brain about local history, and he's of course a wonderful resource about Hudson, the history of Hudson, and he shared with me a number of years ago, 3-4 years ago now, he shared with me his collection of slides. And I recognize that this is really a treasure trove.
Totally. Yes.
And we have, under the guidance and the tutelage of our librarian at the college, Geraldine Demarest, we have created, and it was really her vision and it's her brainchild. She wanted to get into the area of digital archives to supplement the wonderful library that we have there at the college. And so she and I put our heads together, and we thought that the perfect way to really get a digital archive collection started at the college would be with Mr. Kowick's slides.
Oh, terrific.
About urban renewal, the urban renewal project in Hudson. So those slides are now online. The digital, the Arthur Kowick collection, digital collection, is online, and it's you can find it very easily by going to the Columbia Green website, and
terrific.
It's easy to find.
So were Ted, were these photos he took and photos that he collected as a part of the work that was going on in the city at the time?
I don't believe he took the photos. I think what he's indicated to me is that somebody from HUD, I think, was the federal agency who, went into places like Hudson and sort of oversaw the individual urban renewal project. So I think at some point in time, people from HUD went around. They're really wonderful pictures. I believe a number of them were taken in 1966, and then a number of them were taken in 1969. So there's 44, I think there's 44 photographs altogether, and they were done sort of as a preliminary to the beginning of the what eventually became this relatively large urban renewal project.
Very large, and I don't mean to lecture either, but we should put urban renewal in some context here, right? We tend to look back, and I have connection to it because my grandfather was the mayor of the city, Elmer Sheffer, at the time, and we tend to look back and say, oh my goodness, the buildings that were lost in some of that work. But at the time, it was, the consensus was in a lot of places, not just Hudson, that urban renewal meant progress.
Yeah, and I can't speak to what happened in some other places, and I think people get nostalgic, and they also miss some of the architecture. Obviously, what happened in Albany, where there were thousands and thousands of buildings, entire neighborhoods were removed. So that's a little different. But what you see when you take a look at these pictures, there are a lot of buildings that are in very, very poor condition. Many buildings that are in very poor condition. There were a number of buildings that we might look back and we might say, boy, that was a good looking building. There was an old hotel at the corner of Second and Warren. There was an old hotel that was, and you look at it and you say, boy, that was a good looking building. But for the most part, these are buildings that are in very, very bad shape. And Mr. Kowick, and I don't want to speak for him, but he indicated to me that it was very important, that he thought that this commission really did very important work, and he's looking back, he's proud, I think, of what they accomplished
Interesting.
by renovating, making those renovations to this area of the city of Hudson. That was, much of it was in very bad shape.
Yeah, exactly. We think of Hudson today, and there's so much economic activity, but of course at that time it was a different story too. So you're dealing with a different economy and different prospects for the city. And lots of folks think about, and I've talked about the Worth Hotel on the 200 block, and they laugh and say, well, it was torn down for a Dairy Queen, which was what's the plan at the time. But at the same time, there was issues with that building, beautiful building, but the neighbors wanted it to go. A lot of the neighbors wanted it to go from a safety standpoint, and so there's different perspectives on these things. So now you've been working with your students, I saw, Ted, is that right? To try to make sure you get the right information to identify these photos. You've been using aerial photos and other things. Tell us about what you guys have been doing with the photos.
Well, my students have helped me to a degree, but what I've tried to do, which is a little bit sort of above and beyond what you usually get when you talk about digital archives. I love digital archives. I love looking at old photographs. But what you get most of the time, usually is you don't have captions.
Right.
And often you don't even have the photographs identified. And in fact, that's a lot of the fun, is you look at these and you say, boy, who were those people, or where was this building, and so forth. But what I've tried to do is sort of a value added component to this, and I've written captions for each of the photographs. Some of the captions are more detailed than others. There are a number of these photographs which are made. And they're wonderful photographs. They're color, and most of them are very nice photographs. But a number of them, a fair amount of them, are of buildings that were taken. The photographs were made from the alley.
Interesting.
And we have much of our history of Hudson. We have a rich history of alleys in
I
Hudson.
love the alleys.
The alleys are terrific, and so we have, as a result of that, we have a number of these photographs. Maybe a quarter of them are unidentified. Because the photograph was made from the perspective of the alley. The photographer is standing in the alley. So what you get are the backs of buildings. And I have been able, I've had a couple of resources. Predominantly, I had an aerial photograph that Mr. Kowick had that was, by the looks of the automobiles, it was taken in the 50s. And it's an aerial photograph of the western end of Hudson. I think the far right-hand side of the photograph is where Mount Carmel is, which is, I guess that's Second Street, right? Second Street. So we go from Second Street all the way to the river, and it's a wonderful photograph. And what I was able to do is, using a magnifying glass and so forth, I was able to identify a lot of the particular buildings that were located on Front Street. They were located on Warren Street. They were located on Columbia and State Street. And I was able to do that. And then I had my Pokes directory.
Yeah.
This is from 1862, and those of you who have used the Hudson Area Library History Room, we have a wonderful collection of these directories, these city directories at the History Room. It's one of the reasons why I have used the History Room over the years. But anyway, so this Pokes directory is from 1962. So I was able to identify locations. I was able to go to the Pokes and come up with actual street addresses. I was able to, in some circumstances, tell you what business was located at that address. And then I also was sort of supplemented all this. There's the beer's history of
Yes.
Columbia County, which I think is from 1873.
Yep.
Or thereabouts, and then I go back in time, and I could tell you, I reconstructed as best as I could, going from the Beers Atlas forward. So we have, for instance, we have streets that don't exist anymore. Penoyer Street,
Yes.
Fleet Street, Chapel Street. We have these wonderful streets that have been erased by urban renewal, and I tried to go back from 1873, for Penoyer Street, for instance, and take you from 1873 forward.
Right. Yeah.
And it's been a lot of fun.
I bet. I bet. And so how much do you say a third, Ted, you still need to work on?
Probably
yeah.
a quarter to a third.
Okay.
The alley scenes are, in a lot of ways, they're the most interesting.
Yeah, totally.
And they're the most challenging. And people, Gary, since I started this, I've run across people from different walks of life. Peter Chipkowski provided some biographical information for I believe his grandparents.
Right.
They
Chips
had a
Market.
store on Chips Market on Front Street. And I've been able to, sort of in a haphazard manner, I've been able to talk to different people. Joe Carr, you and I know.
Oh, yeah.
Joe Carr. Joe Carr's family lived on what was once West State Street. There was a part of State Street that extended west of Front Street that doesn't exist anymore. So Joe Carr has helped me identify buildings. Bill Hanna, you know Bill Hanna. Bill Hanna, I believe, grew up on Robinson Street in this time period, the 1960s, late 1950s. So I have collected oral history, what I guess we call oral history, and I've stuck as much of that as I can into some of those captions. But what I hope comes out of our chat here today is that people who were around in Hudson in the 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s will take a look at this. We'll take a look at the Art Coic collection, and they will help me. And there's a little click.
I was going to ask, how do they get in touch with you, Ted? Right?
Yeah, there's my name there, and you click a button and whatever, and you can send me an email. And please, any information that you want to share, tell me. Send me as much or as little as you remember, or as you're able to talk about.
Great.
And in particular, take a look at those alley pictures, because they're challenging.
There's a lot of life in Hudson's alleys over the years. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yes.
So tell me, Ted, last question. What's the most interesting thing you've found as a result of this research that you've been doing? A story, something maybe you didn't know? What would you say is something that you learned about Hudson, or that our viewers would find interesting?
That's a good question. You didn't give me that question ahead of time. You tricked me. That's a good question. What's interesting is this is our landscape that has been erased. And it's really, and I'm saying the obvious now, but it becomes clear when you look at these pictures. And there's a number of pictures that were taken from, the photographer was standing on Front Street at various points. And there's, 6 or 7 or 8 photographs of Front Street of buildings that aren't there anymore. And you see the same building from different angles. And you know, you really get a sense of, you know, it's really a sense of stepping back in time.
Yeah.
You have the ability to go into a time machine, more or less, and that's a wonderful thing to be able to do. I didn't grow up in Hudson, of course. You know, Hudson was the place to go to for, as I said, I lived in Claverick, in the provinces, out in Claverick. But you know, my father worked at Gifford Wood. We went to church at Mount Carmel. On the way back from church, I stopped at Basins and got the Sunday paper, and we went to the movies at the community theater, and you know, so Hudson was a place that you went to, and all these things were going on. But to be able to go back in time,
Yeah.
and to look at that, to look at the architecture, there are some beautiful buildings. There was I guess there's a couple of my favorite buildings that are no longer with us. There was a wonderful apartment house on the northern end of Promenade Hill that faced it faced Promenade Hill. The front of the building was on Promenade Hill, and the you know, the west side of it faced the river. But it was a very, very handsome building, and if you can just imagine, you know, you're at the top of the hill there, and whenever that building was built, it looked like a post-Civil War building. It was just in its day, when it was first built, it must have been one of the exclusive, you know, exclusive neighborhoods to live in.
Totally.
And just down the hill from that a little bit was a street which was Marketplace. I think it was called Marketplace. And it was right behind Washington Hose. So if you know where Washington Hose is, Marketplace, I think that was the name of the street. Marketplace was parallel to Front Street, directly behind Washington Hose. And that was back in the early days of the city, the founding of the city. That was the place where there was an open market, and the name for that area, Marketplace, kind of, you know,
Came from that.
Came from that. And there were some beautiful commercial brick buildings, which we have at least a couple of wonderful photographs of these, you know, 3-story brick commercial structures that were erased by urban renewal. So,
and many of those, Ted, you can find, or some of them, you can find in the postcard collection that we have online at the History Room. Yeah, there you can see some of those buildings. Well, this has been fantastic. I hope you get some leads on this, Ted, from this conversation, and so you go to the Columbia Green website, you're able to find it, and they're able to connect to you from the collection.
Yes, and Gary, I appreciate you shining the light a little bit on our project. It's a lot of fun, which is probably the most important reason why we, you know, I know you're a history lover, as I am, and it's a lot of fun. And if we can get some community activity, some community participation, and for those of our many friends who are, you know, haven't lived here for 30 years or 40 years or 20 years, you know, take a look at these pictures and you'll see some buildings in Hudson that you've never seen before.
Exactly. Excellent, Ted. Thank you so much for coming into the History Room on Zoom. And it's good to see you again. I'm going to get you to come back across the river one of these days. But
it's good to see you.
Okay.
It's good to see you, Gary.
Take care, Ted.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.